the Wade Center's podcast.
A podcast of Wheaton College.
So those are human choices that sometimes make it look like God did something bad. Insurance policies call them acts of God, but they're really acts of human stupidity because nature's just doing what nature does.
Right.
It's relatively predictable. The other thing
Here's
too,
a real estate tip. Out in California, they have houses right near the sea where you can't get insurance.
Yeah.
If they won't give you insurance for that house, think about moving somewhere else.
Yeah. Welcome. This is Crystal Downing, and I am joined by my co-director at the Marion E. Wade Center, David C. Downing.
Present.
And our podcast producer, Aaron Hill.
Also present.
And by special request, worldwide speaker Jerry Root. And today, the four of us are going to be discussing C.S. Lewis's The Problem of Pain, which was published originally in 1940. Now, David, why don't you start us off by telling us where this fell in Lewis's canon?
It's actually fairly early. Lewis had only written Pilgrim's Regress and Out of the Silent Planet in the 30s, and Ashley Sampson of the Centenary Press, later part of Jeffrey Bless, said, I would love to have you write a book for the Christian Challenge series. So he read it to the Inklings in 1939, and it came out in 1940. So this is actually his first attempt at Christian apologetics, a book-length study. And he actually wanted to write it anonymously because he thought people who knew him would say, wait a minute, you're no great hero of pain endurance. You know, who are you to write this book? He wrote to his brother, Warren, and said he had a bad toothache. And he said, cynics would say that my whole philosophy fell like a house of cards in the advent of pain. And idealists would say, oh, his thoughts on pain actually really helped him bear that toothache. He said, oddly, my thoughts about the problem of pain were irrelevant and impertinent to my actual experience of pain. So it came out in 1940. He did read sections to the Inklings. Charles Williams looked at him and said, you remember in the book of Job, ultimately God sides with Job in his questioning rather than Job's comforters. You have to remember that people who claim to represent God's point of view on things, they're the sort of people that come out as Job's comforters in the Bible and the sort of people who write books called The Problem of Pain.
Well, that probably explains why he adds a preface to it where he ends saying, any theologian will see easily enough what and how little I have read. So he's acknowledging his limited perspective.
Yeah.
Well, then he goes on to give one of the most erudite and
It's
well-read
a brilliant
expositions.
Yeah,
of
self-deprecating.
There's a great, I want to add, there's a great source online called Lewisiana.nl, Lewisiana.nl, which will explain a lot of the allusions in the book. If you want to know who Walter Hilton is, or a lot of the other characters he mentions, you can go online and get a greater sense of how erudite Lewis was, even in writing a popular book.
Well, I noticed that he quotes a lot of mystics, which helped inspire your book, Into the Region of Awe, and how Lewis was really shaped in his thinking by important advocates of Christian mysticism.
Right, he does. He mentions Walter Hilton and William Law and the Theological Germanica.
David, you mentioned the Challenge series. Can you just explain, what is the Challenge series?
Ashley Sampson, his press, wanted to put out some books explaining Christian faith to non-believers.
Oh.
And I think there are actually 20 titles.
Oh, wow.
Overall, and this was one of the early titles.
Oh, okay.
So it was one of those attempts to do exactly what Lewis wants to do, which is to make Christian faith plausible and winsome and emotionally satisfying to people who are
It just
searching.
made me wonder what the other books were. And yeah, it's clearly some sort of apologetic series. That's interesting.
There are 20 titles, and I haven't heard of any of the other authors.
I think apparently didn't Ronald Knox do one of them?
Oh, did he?
Series, I think. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
The other thing, though, to say this about Lewis, where he acknowledges his limits about what he knows about the problem of pain. And then, like you said, he writes this brilliant book. Lewis said it's easier to judge than to define and describe. And sometimes Lewis's clarity comes out of his willingness to define and describe. But he also reveals to us, I don't think when you talk to somebody about the problem of pain, you're ever going to get to the bottom of that subject.
Right.
I mean, I've written a book on this, and it's, I think I've read 600 books on this topic, and I don't think I'm even anywhere near scratching the surface.
Right.
There's just so much.
Mm-hmm.
And so the consequence is, if you can't say it all, can you say anything at all? And I think you can still have a sure word even if you don't have a last word. And Lewis can carry forth with a confidence of a sure word because of his definitions and his descriptions, even though he doesn't have a last word. That's extremely helpful in that regard.
And if you aren't convinced by his argument, you still get new theological insights through how he is grappling with the issue, which is all we can do is grapple with the issue. I know that Dorothy Sayers recommended this book, Problem of Pain, more than any other book by C.S. Lewis, repeatedly in her letters where people were asking her, especially about what I grew up calling the problem of evil. But I like Lewis's title better because trying to explain evil just puts it more in a metaphysical conversation, whereas pain, we all know pain.
Yeah.
We've all experienced pain, and then to draw theological insights out of that is so profound. And Sayers herself went through a lot of pain, and I think that's why this book was very powerful for her.
I wanted to mention a quote. You guys were talking about his tone. He says, "How can I say with sufficient tenderness what needs to be said? It does not matter that I know I must become, in the eyes of every hostile reader, as it were, personally responsible for all the sufferings I try to explain." And so he adopts this tone throughout the book where he's kind of like, I get it. Like, I get how you think, I get how you feel, I've been there. And I think that makes it easier, and it keeps his explanations from coming across as, I have all the answers, sit down, let me pontificate, and I can explain, everything that's wrong with the world in this small little book. Other books that you come across that try to talk about this topic kind of fall into that trap, and I think Lewis's tone really helps.
That was another ironic comment by Charles Williams. He said, "I'm so glad you were able to tackle the problem of pain in 100 pages." So they had a lot of back and forth. I do think you talk about empathizing. It's a brilliant opening. And he says, a few years ago when I was an atheist, I saw this vast empty universe. Life seems to be some sort of a mistake. Animals suffer, but humans have consciousness, so they know they're going to suffer, and they wonder why they suffer.
Yeah.
And he concludes by saying, when you look at just the universe we live in and the world we live in, you have to say that either there is no spirit behind creation or a spirit indifferent to good and evil, or else an evil spirit. And it's a powerful opening. Often when you read books of apologetics, they start out assuming Christian values and Christian beliefs, and they more or less beg the question.
Yeah.
I've seen apologetics books where they quote the Bible, and I go, well, what about readers who don't accept the Bible as authoritative? So Max McLean did a wonderful job in his one-act play, The Most Reluctant Convert. He starts with this powerful, eloquent explanation of why it's okay to be an atheist, or why people become atheists.
I was going to say, it's probably the best explanation for why someone would choose to be an atheist that I've ever read. It's like, if I was going to debate somebody about what it means to be an atheist, I'd probably use Lewis's example here.
I agree.
It's clear that he had been there mentally.
Well, and he gains credit for his argument by being able to state the other side so clearly.
Yes.
So people know that he was heard. But it's interesting because he comes to the end of all of these complaints and he realizes he hasn't fully been honest. So he says, but I realize it's not only a problem of pain, there's a problem of good. And if the universe is half so good as some people claim it is, how did we ever come to attribute it to a good God in the first place? In The Weight of Glory, Lewis says, if our religion is objective, we must never avert our eyes from those elements in it which seem puzzling or repellent. For it's precisely in the puzzling or repellent where we discover what we do not yet know and need to know. That kind of honesty about his own Christian faith makes Lewis's argument so strong. But Lewis also holds the feet to the fire to the people who are opposed to Christianity, that they would also argue with equal objectivity. And I think that's important as well.
Right.
And so that moves Lewis then from these complaints about the faith into another realm that opens up the door more widely.
And that's what I like about he starts us with an introduction, talks about what was convincing to him as an atheist, but then presents those things that brought him to faith. And he starts with the idea of the numinous, which many people align with his idea of Sehnsucht, this sense that there's something beyond. We all have this awe for something greater.
Yeah.
And then also he introduces the idea of morality, that even the most virulent atheist has a sense of good versus evil. Even an atheist will say what Hitler did was evil. Well, where do atheists get their moral sense?
Yeah.
You can't denounce a sense of creator God and then just assume morality just rises up from the masses. And then Lewis proceeds to say both the numinous and morality then were joined together in Judaism. And then finally, you get God entering history in the form of Jesus Christ so that God's own self experienced pain, that we are not experiencing something that God incarnate did not experience.
It's interesting, as you mentioned this, Crystal, Lewis attributes these areas to Rudolf Otto's book, The Idea of the Holy. Yeah. And if you read the lists of books that Lewis said were the most important to him, it always appears on the top 10. And when Lewis is early on in The Problem of Pain talking about this, he recognizes it's a religious question. In Mere Christianity, he's clear that all the great religions have more in common with each other than any of us would have with the materialist who denies the supernatural completely. But he takes those three things from Otto, that we have this, Christians have this in common with all the religions. We believe in a divine essence, the numinous, the thing that inspires awe. We believe in the moral law that everybody fails to keep, and we believe that the divine essence is a custodian of the moral law. So we have this offense against the divine essence. So the uniqueness of Christianity is not in those three areas, but in how we fix the offense. We don't believe by ritual we can do this. We believe it only comes from the incarnation, and the incarnation's important in this book. God enters into the realm of pain. God enters into the realm of our problem.
In fact, that is key to his addressing the issue of both heaven and hell, insofar as most other religions establish heaven and hell as something you work for, something that you get in exchange for certain behavior or certain ritual, whereas Christianity, unlike other religions, is predicated on a gift, and that is the gift of Jesus Christ, who paid the price for pain. But let's see how Lewis gets us there. After his introduction, then, he gives us a chapter on God's omnipotence. What do you want to say about that and how he handles it, David?
Well, I like the idea that God can't produce something illogical. God couldn't create a married bachelor. So saying he's omnipotent doesn't mean he can do something that's illogical or nonsensical. But I love his comments that perhaps God would try to restrain evil or suffering by, after Adam's sin, he erases his mistake and starts over. But then he would have to erase the second mistake and the third mistake. And eventually he's erasing all human mistakes. He makes the same point. If somebody was going to do evil with a piece of wood, he turns it into a flower. Or he takes even a malicious thought and turns it into a good thought. But in doing so, the whole experiment of giving free will to other creatures is erased because he takes away their free will. So I thought that was a powerful argument. He has this fascinating metaphysic of God needed to create a medium in which consciousnesses could meet.
Yes.
And if I and you had no bodies and no substance, how would I know my thoughts from your thoughts? So if we're going to have an arena in which we have consciousness, there needs to be some neutral matter which obeys its own laws.
And so, something to talk about as well.
Right. That was a fascinating excursion into metaphysics. We need some physical world to give us an arena for consciousness to exist, individual consciousness.
The area of philosophy and theology where the problem of evil is discussed is called theodicy. Comes from two Greek words, theos, God, and dike, righteousness or justice. It's a justification of God in light of the problem of evil. And Christians have had two primary traditions. There's more, it can be nuanced further, but one is a free will theodicy, and it comes from the tradition of Augustine and Boethius and the consolation philosophy. And the other is a soul-making theodicy that comes from St. Irenaeus. And so the problem on divine omnipotence is basically a free will theodicy chapter. The next chapter on divine goodness is a soul-making theodicy chapter. But in the thing you were talking about, David, if God makes something, he can't both make it and not make it at the same time. If he gives me free will, then he can't remove the consequences of that free will without making nonsense. So it's like you say, if I say something stupid, and I'm very capable of doing that, and you point it out and I get upset, so I get a stick to beat you over the head with it. I've prayed, God, please remove evil, but as I come down to hit you with the head, he turns the stick into a feather, like you said. You turn around, you like to be tickled, you're happy about the result. And it produced the exact opposite. Produced the exact opposite response I wanted. So I pull out the .357 Magnum.
Oh, jeez. Wow, that got dark.
Talk about pain.
I fire 2 rounds at you, and God turns the lead bullets into marshmallows, and they ricochet gently off of your stomach. You catch them. You love marshmallows. You pop those puppies into your mouth. I'm furious. I throw the gun at you. God turns it into a sponge. I start screaming obscenities. God dissipates the sound waves. Well, in that moment, he has utterly taken away my free will, if there's no consequence. And God doesn't do nonsense, as you said.
Right.
So what does he do given these parameters? And interestingly enough, he enters into that world, back, Crystal, to the incarnation. He enters into that world and he assumes the consequence in himself when he dies on the cross for our sins and so on. But also, there's some character that could be developed in us in those times of suffering and so on, and that moves us on through the next areas of the book.
Well, marshmallows have a lot of refined sugar, so in the long term, you may have done the harm that you
may have
wanted
given him
to.
diabetes.
You just had to be more patient.
Jeez. It reminded me of playing soccer with my niece during Thanksgiving. She kept changing the rules so that, like, her goal counted 2, and then the size of their goal kept increasing. And eventually we just stopped playing because it was, what's the point?
Right.
There are no rules. And if
she eliminated the consequences of the game.
Yeah, if she's going to change the rules every time something happens, then we're just kind of out here kicking a ball around and we're not playing soccer anymore.
Right.
It's a really good point because you could say there are rules to the game of chess, just like there are rules to the game of reason.
Yeah.
Knowing the rules doesn't guarantee I win the game every time I play,
Yeah.
but not having the rules makes the game impossible.
Well, there's no game.
It doesn't exist.
But here's Lewis then employing the rules of reason to discuss this thorny topic. And he makes sense because he's consistent with the rules, and he shows that people who are mad at God because of evil in the universe are often not playing by the rules because they're expecting God to do nonsense.
Right.
Yeah, there's an old conundrum. Can God make a rock he cannot lift? And one theologian, it wasn't Lewis, said, yes, he made human consciousness. He created something that he doesn't entirely try to control.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's an interesting answer to that conundrum.
And the paradox that evil exists because of God's goodness.
Yeah.
Insofar as God created us with free will, and God doesn't turn the bullets into marshmallows. God doesn't intervene because God values our own freedom. And so what happens in a lot of people who complain about the problem of evil, it comes from a self-centered idea that where they think they shouldn't have to suffer. I remember I was talking to one of my students, former students who had married, and then her husband cheated on her, and it was very, very painful. And she said, why did God even allow me to fall in love with this person?
Wow.
And I said, well, what did you expect? What if the first time you met him, God made you throw up on his shoes, which would have prevented him from asking you out in the first place. If that had happened to you then, you would have said, why did God allow me to throw up all over this guy's shoes? How could God do that? And we are so limited in our perspective. It reminds me of someone who influenced C.S. Lewis greatly, G.K. Chesterton, who talked about reality being like this huge tapestry in the sky. And it's like God from above sees the whole picture, whereas we're underneath and we just see all the knots and the threads and you can't really get the picture. And we obsess about a particular pain, not realizing that that is, and C.S. Lewis actually quotes Keats' famous phrase, it is a veil of soul making.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The idea of omnitemporality that you're saying Lewis got from Chesterton, he probably got that from Boethius primarily, because in The Discarded Image, he gives a 16-page description of that book, and he talks about this omnitemporality feature, that God, all moments are always present to him.
Right.
And so consequently, even he eliminates the problem of foreknowledge and free will. God doesn't look down a continuum and see what we're going to do, so when we get to that moment, we have no choice in the matter. No, he sees it as always happening. I see you shaking your head yes right now, but I'm not influencing you to shake your head just because I see it in my now. Back to a point you made, the thing you said about good, which is really important, and Lewis constantly emphasizes this. Evil compares to good like bread mold compares to bread. It's a perversion of the good. But even man can take bread mold and make something good out of it, penicillin. We have to believe that even if there's a perversion of good, that God, who in his omnipotence, in his omniscience, in his omnitemporality, can make his own penicillin out of the bad of human.
Yeah, all things work together for good.
Yeah.
I mean, we're explicitly told that in Scripture. And this issue of temporality is key to his whole argument, that humans, as they're grappling with the problem of pain, they don't realize the limitation of their perspective, that they are temporal, whereas God transcends temporality. That is key to his argument.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
but also central to the argument, though, is there's evil that's a consequence of the ill use of free will.
yes.
But then in that chapter on goodness, the suffering that we endure can create in us character. And he talks about those different examples, like the artist's love for the work. He may mash it down. The animal husbandman's love for the dog. He may discipline the dog, but the dog lives a better life in the long run. The love of a father for a child and so on. I think of the love of a coach for his athletes. He may push them because he wants them to excel. So that idea of free will and soul-making, suffering, you said the
veil of
Keats
soul.
passage.
Yeah.
Now, what do you think? Usually when people talk about the problem of evil, they talk about moral evil and natural evil. So on the one hand, we have Hitler, who's making very bad choices and creating a lot of suffering and injustice.
You guys heard it here. Hitler made very bad choices.
Yeah, there you go.
David Downing.
Exactly.
Are you sure, David?
Yeah.
Are you sure?
Make
That
one
sounds
of those,
pretty
go
judgmental
out
to
on that limb
me.
right there.
Yeah,
All right.
one of those Facebook things with the clouds in the sky. And here's a
David
quote.
Downing. Hitler
David
made-
Downing. Hitler made a lot of bad choices. Well, compare that to natural evil, where we have a tsunami, and nobody created this huge wave which wiped out tens of thousands of people. What do you think of Lewis's addressing of both questions? The moral evil, we need to have free will, but what about natural evil?
Well, in natural evil, it's interesting because there's lots of possibilities. Sometimes we say it's natural evil, but it may be human bad choices that create
like
the
global
problem.
warming.
Well, or I choose to live where tsunamis may come ashore.
Exactly.
I choose to, you can get really cheap property in California on the San Andreas Fault, no problem. And you can get nice sea cliff views, but if I live in a typhoon area, it may be beautiful, but I need to board up my house and get out of there every once in a while. So those are human choices that sometimes make it look like God did something bad. Insurance policies call them acts of God, but they're really acts of human stupidity because nature's just doing what nature does.
Right.
It's relatively predictable. The other thing
Here's a
too,
real estate tip. Out in California, they have houses right near the sea where you can't get insurance.
yeah.
if they won't give you insurance for that house, think about moving somewhere else.
Yeah.
That's
or
a little
take the risk,
Yeah.
Some people that they take the risk. But the other thing though too is that sometimes there are things that happen in nature that would appear to have diabolical forces behind it. When Jesus is in the boat and a storm comes up on the sea, and these fishermen who have made their living by the sea are shocked at how bad this storm is. They wake up Jesus. He's asleep in the stern of the boat. And I think they're waking him up to say, all hands on deck. Here's a bailing pail to help us. But he rebukes the wind and the sea. If he would have seen that storm coming from the Father, he probably would have said something like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, his New Year 1945, it be ours to drink the cup of grieving, even to the dregs of pain at thy command. We will not falter, thankfully receiving all that comes from thy loving hand. No, he rebukes the storm. He sees some other source behind that storm. So I think those things can happen in our world as well. So it's a complex number of circumstances that could cause these what we would call natural evils, and we need to think through, well, let's look at the details and see if we could discern what kind of thing is this. Nature doing what it's doing, human stupidity, diabolical evil. We've got to figure it out.
Well, so at one point, Lewis seems to imply that the fall of Lucifer gave us a creation which is groaning for perfection. He seems to talk about two falls. And so in Lucifer's rebellion, we have a fallen world, but then in human rebellion, we chose the wrong side. He says at one point, we are not sick people who need to be improved. We are rebels who need to lay down our arms.
Yeah.
But what do you think of his seeming theory that Satan's rebellion had something to do with natural evil on Earth?
Yeah, I was going to say that explanation, which, kind of accounts for like animal predation, because at one point he talks about, maybe we were put here to try and help the animals get along or something like that. And I understand that, and I see that a lot of Christians, they struggle with, animals killing other animals just to eat and to get by. But if you actually go read the book of Job, God goes through a big, long list, and one of the things he does is he says, like, I feed the vultures and I feed the lions, and in Psalms it actually celebrates that God gives the lions their prey. So I feel like that's one of those things where we struggle with creation in which animals have to eat other animals, but then we eat animals for dinner and it doesn't seem to bother us very much. And so, I don't know, I think that's one of those things we want to try and explain and call evil, but it may not be evil. It may be God providing for us, because all of us have to eat something. God didn't create a world where we don't need food of some kind. We're going to have to eat vegetables or whatever the case is. So, I don't know. I don't know if I buy his explanation there, particularly just because of those examples from Scripture where
Well, I think
God
what
affirms doing
helps
that.
explain it is Lewis repeatedly, and this surprised me, Lewis repeatedly endorses the idea of evolution. And he created the heavens and the earth, but he created the earth according to certain principles of the development of nature. And he is endorsing the idea that the first human developed out of the animals, and there was a God-infused moment of consciousness, and this is known as theistic evolution. So if he started the world according to certain natural principles, he does not impede those natural principles except at certain significant times, and we call those miracles. And that is probably the reason that Lewis felt the need to write a book called Miracles, because his problem of pain is saying that God doesn't constantly intervene and stop every tsunami. God doesn't stop every lion who might be attacking a Christian in the Roman Colosseum. And then the real hard question, he even makes this fascinating comment that C.S. Lewis, the real problem is why some people do not suffer. He makes such a case that suffering is part of the human condition.
Yeah. I was also going to say in the chapter on human pain, he talks about the danger of self-sufficiency and how you have, people sort of living this middle-class existence that God may allow to suffer. And he says, the reason why God allows us to suffer in some of those cases is because the greatest danger to us is that we would not depend on God, that we would not surrender and rely on Him. So I can see a sense in which natural disasters are a constant reminder that we're not in charge. We're not entirely self-sufficient. We're not in control of these things. I mean, what is the first thing that people do when there's a natural disaster? They cry out and they pray and they turn to God. And so, I don't know, it makes me wonder if, maybe that's another way that God's like, hey, you need to depend on me. This world does not operate just on what you want alone. You have to depend on me.
Well, there's a great line in this book where he says, God whispers to us in our pleasures. He speaks to us in our conscience, but he shouts to us in our pains.
Right.
It's God's megaphone saying you are contingent, you are dependent. You can become very complacent. This is true of all of us. When you encounter adversity or suffering, you suddenly go, God, I need some help with this. Can you really? And in a way, it's a shame that once the adversity disappears or the suffering, we often just go back to our complacent state.
Yeah. He says prostitutes are in no danger of finding their present life so satisfactory that they cannot turn to God. The proud, the avarice, the self-righteous are in that danger.
Right.
The chapter on wickedness, so, and when he talks about self-deception, or what Aristotle called akrasia or akrasia, the justification of my bad act that leads to moral blindness. So some people, as you were saying there, in crisis, they'll turn to God, but a lot of people don't. They shake their fist at God.
Yeah,
right.
Captain Ahab, right? And Moby Dick and so on. So I think that the reason why people are so hostile is usually because they've so rationalized their bad behavior.
Right.
But one thing I have to make a comment about evolution. It's true, Lewis was a theistic evolutionist, but he is very opposed to evolutionism.
Yes, especially social biology.
Well,
yes.
and evolution that is materialistic.
Right.
And he writes an essay called The Funeral of the Great Myth, which is taking to task that kind of thing. So to make that distinction, as you did earlier, I think is important.
Yeah.
And he also has a very high view of the story of Adam's fall. It's very important in his theology that Adam made this mistake. And that we all are in Adam, and we just repeat that same mistake.
Yeah.
I love the line. He says, we have to tread Adam's dance backwards.
Right.
So he really thinks that the book of Genesis is saying something very profound about human nature. We all want to turn towards self rather than toward God.
Right.
Well, I think Lewis is also clear, however, that human nature, that humans are good by nature. The preposition by is important here. Because we're made by God. There's at least four areas of theology that are affected on your view of man. Your theology proper, your doctrine of God. In him there is no darkness at all. He can't make bad stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Second is your doctrine of Christ. If Christ became fully man and sin was essential to what it is to be human, then he would have had to become a sinner, but the scriptures are explicit. In him there was no sin at all. Then your biblical anthropology, you have four categories of man in scripture. Adam and Eve before the fall, no sin. Adam and Eve and all who follow afterwards, the category we're in, sin. Christ in his humanity, no sin. Man in his glorified state, no sin. So you have four categories of man, sin's present one. It can't be the definitive characteristic. And in your doctrine of salvation, if you see a pig wallowing in the mire, you don't kick the pig. He's living according to his nature. He needs mud to keep his body cool because he doesn't have sweat glands. But if you see a man living in sin and degradation, do you tell him he shouldn't? Why? If he's living according to his nature, let him go. The proclamation of the gospel is a statement that man is not living according to his nature. And Lewis makes a big mistake here in the book when he talks about Calvin's doctrine of total depravity. He said if we were totally depraved, we wouldn't know it. He's not fair to Calvin there, because Calvin, I'm sure he read him, but probably just glossed over this one part. Calvin says humans can do good, even though they're sinful. They can't do anything of salvific merit. But Jonas Salk cures polio. It was a fundamentally good act, but it doesn't get him into heaven. So when Calvin talks about it, he says total depravity doesn't mean we're incapable of doing good. It's we're incapable of doing anything that obligates God to save us by virtue of our good work. And Lewis misses out on that, and I think it's one of the weaknesses.
Although it may be, what I've discovered is that Calvin is far more nuanced and sophisticated than a lot of Calvinists.
Well, I think you're right.
Yeah.
And I think Lewis may be responding to Calvinists who just reduce it to this idea.
Yeah.
In fact, we knew someone who was a Christian with a PhD who said, well, if God wants to create crack babies, God has every right to do it because God is omnipotent and sovereign. And just this guy was just this rabid Calvinist. So I like how one of my colleagues at the last institution I taught dealt with this. She said maybe that word depravity is the problem. Many times it's the language we use that creates the problem. So she would talk about total depravity. We have been deprived of our union with God because of our own selfishness. God gave us free will, and we chose autonomy rather than relationship with God. And it's because we chose to be deprived of that relationship with God, we are embedded in sin.
The one thing that's helpful when it comes to Calvin, and I know this about Lewis, not Calvin, is I have students that tell me Calvin said this, and I go, well, did you read him?
Yeah, right.
Because if you read him, you might have gotten something different. So you're always at the advantage of the person arguing a point if they haven't read the book.
Right, right.
And then the other thing too, it's interesting to me because there's another weakness in the book that I think is glaring, and yet it grows out of Lewis's tenderness. And it's when you get to the chapters on animals. So if he believes that some evil is a consequence of the ill use of free will, and animals don't have free will, and some evil and suffering and pain can produce character, Christ-likeness in people's lives, and the animals don't have souls, so their souls can't be improved, no soul-making there. What do we do with animals? And Lewis comes up with this judgment. Well, I think maybe the animals of believers will have the benefits of the believers imputed to them.
Right.
And his friend Austin Farah, in his book, Light on C.S. Lewis, he wrote in that chapter, at that moment, Lewis's imagination loosed itself from the bonds of reason. and Evelyn Underhill wrote to him. She loved the book. But she said to him, your chapter on animals is nonsense, and it lacks a little wildness. You know, it's almost like your vision of God. He's good, but he's not tame.
I wanted to go back, Crystal, to your comment about our friend who said the sovereignty of God would justify any kind of behavior. Lewis says that God is not so far above us that our white is his black. It's more like the perfect circle versus the child's attempt to draw a circle. And I think that's important. Another mystic that Lewis read was Meister Eckhart, and he said, God is so far above us, we don't even know what goodness means in God's nature. And Lewis is not comfortable with that idea.
Yeah, I think that's what he's trying to deconstruct there. I was going to say, Dietrich Bonhoeffer in Creation and Fall says that the same thing. Essentially, by rejecting God as the giver of all good things, we're forced to provide for ourselves out of our own gifts, and we're just utterly contingent and incapable of doing that. And so we sort of created this situation for ourselves. We kind of have to, we made our bed, now we have to lie in it kind of a situation. I was going to mention the Human Pain Continued chapter, which I thought that is it maybe one of his intentionally funny titles for a chapter, Human Pain Continued. But he mentions sort of 6 paradoxes. Can you guys talk about those? I had some thoughts about them. I wanted to mention, the sort of overarching point he's making there is if human suffering and pain leads to our salvation and us becoming better, then as long as we need to become better, we're always going to have to expect it. And he sort of says there's a level of human suffering that's kind of like baked into existence. We shouldn't expect to get rid of all poverty in this world, that kind of a thing. And then he also says in the beginning, there's this paradox of, Jesus says, blessed are the poor, but then we're also supposed to help and give to the poor to alleviate their poverty. So are we sort of taking away their blessedness by giving to them? He sort of talks about there's paradoxes that are baked in. I wanted to just get y'all's opinion on those 6 paradoxes that he mentions there.
Pain must have existed before the fall, because when the fall occurs, God says he'll multiply the woman's pain in childbirth. You can't multiply nothing.
Infinity times 0 is 0. You're correct.
If a person was taking care of the Garden of Eden and they had a ladder up against a tree and they were picking fruit and they lost their balance and fell, there would still be pain. Pain is not necessarily bad. And I think guilt isn't necessarily bad. Guilt is moral pain, and it tells me get out of that situation. You're just going to hurt yourself. And physical pain also tells me that there needs to be limitation to my activity. If I don't do that, then the pain is increased, and the pain is increased to stop the rebellious will.
Yeah.
So I'm just not convinced it's pain is a bad thing.
Okay.
Right.
You think that's what he's trying to get at in that chapter?
I think a little bit.
I think so too.
That's my opinion, but
Well, he also makes a point that you don't want to confuse self-surrender to God with self-surrender in the political realm.
Right.
That's a good point.
We were talking earlier about people who feel very righteous because they condemn racism or sexism or other kinds of injustice, but they're not actually practicing individual virtue. They're just saying, I'm a virtuous person because I have all these high-minded opinions. And I like Lewis's emphasis that we need to think about our individual virtues and vices rather than saying, I'm a good person because I support the correct political causes.
Yeah, I was going to say, I told my wife at one point that our selective application of Romans 13 to when things happen with the government based on which administration happens to be in charge at the moment kind of tells you a lot about how we sort of map that self-surrender onto our situation whenever it's convenient.
Right.
That's
and the pocket, he talks about these pocket groups. And so you identify with a certain group and their morality. Sayers has a wonderful comment, and again, she read and benefited from Problem of Pain. So this was an article she wrote for the London Times, and this was during the war, so this was soon after the Problem of Pain, and she wrote, "Why doesn't God smite Hitler dead? That is a question a little remote from us. Why, madam, did he not strike you dumb and imbecile before you uttered that baseless and unkind slander the day before yesterday? And why, sir, did he not cause your hand to rot off at the wrist before you signed your name to that dirty little bit of financial trickery? Your misdeeds and mine are nonetheless repellent because our opportunities for doing damage are less spectacular than those of some other people."
That's from her essay, The Triumph of Easter. And I read that every year during Holy Week. But how it ends is also informative because she says, in essence, the angel told the women, go tell the disciples and Peter. So Peter had denied Christ, but the angel wants to make sure Peter still feels included, that the graces of God operational in this fallen, broken world can still include the person to come back and be restored to God. And then she makes a comment, something like this. This isn't the exact quote. Isn't it too bad Judas didn't stick around? Because they would have said, tell the disciples and Peter and Judas. So I think that Sayers is so honest in that essay, but I think she captures the sentiment of Lewis in this book too.
Yeah.
And in his fiction as well. Lewis's fiction plays these themes out as well. Edmund is redeemed. Edmund becomes a father confessor to Eustace. Eustace is redeemed. Eustace becomes the one who's sent to get Rilian. And you see this progress of the weight of glory. There are no ordinary people. All of us are burdened with the weight of our neighbor's glory. It's wonderful.
This is such a wonderful conversation. I think we need to have a second session among the four of us.
We had such a great time discussing pain. We'd really like to,
Yeah.
We'd really like to draw it out
Human
further.
pain continued.
Yeah.
That's what we're going to title the chapter. That's perfect.
Okay. So I welcome you all as listeners to join us next time as we continue the conversation and talk a little bit more about C.S. Lewis's attitude about animals, as well as the culmination of our sense of being with God, our Creator and Redeemer in heaven.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, vast collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.